What are some NSFW history facts that do not get taught in schools? Every year, it was the pharaoh's solemn duty to go to the banks of the Nile, disrobe, and masturbate. A great many other men would follow him. And when the pharaoh was done, they too would bash one out on the banks. Further, it was believed that the pharaoh had to be sure that as great an amount of his gentleman's relish as possible landed in the river itself rather than on the land in order to guarantee a good future harvest. Peter the Great scoured the Russian Empire in search of dwarfs and giants in an effort to breed a race of each. While he couldn't find enough giants, he found many dwarfs. He would bake a huge pie and have a dwarf get naked and wait inside it to jump out and scare guests. In addition to using them as regular stewards and servants and such. That was the tip of Peter's crazy. Royal family members had people witness them having sex so they could confirm the legitimacy of the heir. Back in the day, pre-revolutionary times or so, one of the only things that women in the English colonies were allowed to have expertise on was the female body reproductive system. Occasionally, a case would come up in court that required the inspection of a woman's body. Usually it would be to determine if she had been unped or otherwise had sex out of wedlock. To handle these sorts of cases, the court would convene a jury of women from a nearby town to perform the inspection and report their findings. In one particular case though, a married woman was petitioning for the annulment of her marriage on the basis that her husband was impotent. To test these claims, the court convened a jury of women tasked solely with attempting to bring the woman's husband to erection. The article didn't mention the result of this case, but this remains one of very few cases that a jury of women was convened in a court of law for any purpose besides their expertise in women's bodies. Edit. I, for one, like to think he was playing the long con the whole time. John F. Kennedy was dating Miss Denmark in the 1940s. And when they stayed at Sumter House in Charleston, the FBI bugged their room because they thought she may be a Nazi spy. Turns out they didn't hear a lot of conversation, but instead a lot of NSFW time. Tapes are in the Library of Congress for those interested. John Harvey Kellogg, one of the Kellogg brothers who invented breakfast cereal, advocated for sewing silver wire through boys' foreskin to prevent them from masturbating. Strange fellow. Cornflakes were developed to lower men's libidos when eaten. Edit. This is going to be a till tomorrow. When Marie Antoinette was imprisoned by the French citizens, they took her kids. Then they had her oldest son unped by prostitutes so that he would contract their STDs. They then tried to use this as grounds to try her for abusing her children. The accusations went nowhere, so the poor kid was given a ton of venereal diseases for nothing. Edit. Spelled Marie Antoinette's name wrong. Edit 2. Holy FCK. So many upvotes. Also, to those who are asking my source, I read it on Wikipedia. I went back to try and get a more detailed source. Wikipedia source was Common Eagle. Susan, 2009. Arith registered sign said. The Fate of Marie Antoinette's Daughter. London. Bloomsbury Publishing. p. 137. ISBN 978-0-7475-9666-0. Hope this helps anybody who is curious. The dresses and corsets worn by women in the court of King Louis XI were so cumbersome and difficult to get out of that women would often take a dump in the hallways of the Versailles Palace during grand balls. The morning after, the corners of hallway in the palace would have piles of tea stacked up that the servants would have to clean up. French President Felix IV registered sign died getting a blowjob from his mistress. He had a petite mort, followed by a grand mort. I'm going to take everything I read in this thread as fact. I wish this thread had its own sub. I would read it every day. Thomas Granger was the first juvenile to be executed in what would become the USA. He was convicted of buggery with a mare, a cow, 2 goats, several sheep, 2 calves, and a turkey, and hung in September 1642. Edit. Thank you everyone for educating me about the difference between hung and hanged. I'll never get the image of horse stick out of my head now. Edit the second. Gilded for talking about animal buggery. What a world we live in. Buggery. Anal intercourse. You're welcome. I did the legwork for you. The first use of legalized prostitution in the United States was in Nashville, TN, after it was occupied by the Union Army. Rates of STDs dramatically decreased after the new regulations were implemented. Pancho Villa and his buddies would go through cities and they would kidnap the cute ladies. And they would never be seen again. In preparation for this, the ladies would go to the mud and appear to be very filthy so they wouldn't be taken away. They took my grandmother's aunt. In addition to all the other hijinks Columbus got up to. In later years, he ran a sex slave business from the New World. He remarked in a letter to a friend that 9-year-old girls were a particularly hot item with the nobility of Europe. Egyptians also had a priestess called the god's wife whose job was to perform sex acts on a statue of a deity. That's statutory RP, isn't it? Edit. So that's what that feels like. Thanks. George Washington was a total poonhound. He once got transferred to a remote base because all the other officers' wives wanted to bone him. In early Japan, high-class Japanese often had boys men on the side they would use for pleasure. It wasn't seen as gay or wrong because that concept hadn't been imported from the West yet. They were considered a mistress and were usually well taken care of. Lyndon Johnson was known for pulling out his pecker during meetings, which he named, no kidding, Jumbo. I always thought he missed a good thing by not naming it LBJ, Lyndon's Big Johnson. With this post being so big, this comment will be lost, but if any of you are interested in posting, we have a very tiny community called Dance for Facts that I am a mod of. Nobody has posted in over a year, so please do check it out if it interests you. Edit. Thank you all for checking out the sub and helping it grow. Also, this is my highest rated comment, so obligatory thanks for the internet points. The Welsh would often go to England to steal sheep. This was punishable by death. So when they were caught they would say that they went there to FCK the sheep, which was not punishable by death. And now, after 20 goddamn years on this planet, I finally find out why the Welsh are sheep sugars. Johnny Appleseed didn't go around planting apple seeds just because. He sold the trees to settlers and they used the apples to make booze. Tasty apples are a mutation, and apples trees used to make edible apples don't come from seeds. They come from grafting other tasty apple trees. I'm stealing this because it was so good. Apparently, during the writing of the Declaration, Ben Franklin would sneak off at lunch. Someone would always have to go fetch him and they would always find him in the middle of a room surrounded by naked women. Edit. Some woman pinches his belly. Sir, can you imagine all that weight on a woman? Madam. 20 minutes ago all this weight was on a woman. Anne Frank's diary talked a lot about masturbation, but most of it was edited out. Ben Franklin liked to take air baths, meaning he would just sit on his balcony for hours, naked. The US had a eugenics program into the 70s that sterilized thousands of women, mostly black poor. They would often do this under the guise of an emergency appendectomy post-birth. A woman gave birth to a RP baby and didn't know why she could never have children after. She was able to receive damages. Look up Buck v. Bell. Edit. And from others reminders. Native American women were targeted too. And surprisingly, aside from targeting groups, women deemed mentally unfit, ill, morally inferior, or too low of IQ were included in this. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, is responsible for high heels. He thought they made his ass look great. At Andrew Jackson's funeral, his pet parrot was removed because he would not stop cursing. That the number of US presidents who had affairs while in office is much larger than those who remained faithful. Empress Theodora of the Byzantine Empire was a hooker, and came to power by hooking up with the emperor of the time. I actually didn't know until recently. But the Corps of Discovery only ate meat and had incredible constipation. One day they all ate pills they named thunderclappers, which made them shit out everything immediately. But the pills had a bit of metal in them. So if you go out on the same trail as the Corps of Discovery with a metal detector, you can find the exact place Lewis, Clark and the rest of the Corps took the biggest shits of their lives. Edit. My top comment is now about the biggest little shit storm in history. JFK cheated on his wife and was a super sex addict. Dude fk'd a lot of women. Even saying if doesn't have sex 3 times a day he gets headaches. And he had a hell of a pickup line. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for the president of your country. FDR's children actively tried to get him laid. They found him mistresses to FCK. The US government killed 10,000 people during Prohibition by poisoning industrial alcohol, allegedly to stop people from drinking it. Savannah Garr was only saved from Sherman's march to the sea because a former mistress of his lived in the city. She came to him begging for him to spare the city. She stayed the night. Yay. I'd say that was the greatest use of the power of the PSSY in American history. Everybody say hi to the BuzzFeed interns taking notes. The majority of troops, German and Allied, were on amphetamines and or cocaine during World War II. Lots of guys were high in Vietnam too. When Edgar Allan Poe was 27, he married his 13-year-old cousin. He did it in order to save her and her mother from the poorhouse. Some guy Rufus Wilmot Griswold, who really hated Poe, managed to get access to Poe's whole estate after his death and rewrote his history so he would be viewed as this alcoholic, druggie, pedophile. Nelson Rockefeller died on top of his mistress in his office and she had to call a co-worker to get him off of her. Queen Victoria was a freak in the sheets. She reportedly lamented to her doctor that she would have no more fun in bed after he told her to quit having sex all the time if she didn't want to have more kids. Tsar Nicholas II's parents were vehemently opposed to him marrying Alexandra Feodorovna Alex of Hesse. And to try to get him to stop pursuing her, they hired a ballerina to be his girlfriend mistress and sent him on a lad's tour of Japan. Didn't work. He married her. Everyone except for him hated her guts. Also, Madame du Pompadour likely had some issues that made sex painful and unpleasant for her, maybe largely untreated STDs caught up with her. Maybe it was just something wrong with the plumbing itself. We're not entirely sure. So she became BFFs with the Queen, made herself completely indispensable to the king, and handpicked his good time girls so none of them would supplant her socially. Christopher Columbus kept a diary and it is easily on par with some of the worst acts of ISIS. Rape, murder, and torture were pretty common. One passage is about how he fed babies to dogs and made the mothers watch. Edit to add. I link to a PDF of his journal below. Feeding babies to dogs is not some clickbait worst of the 177-page diary. Parts of it is gruesome and done in such a nonchalant narration that it's kinda freaky. Rasputin was hung like a f-king horse. J. Edgar Hoover, the first director of the FBI, was probably a gay cross-dresser in the closet. Rape of Nanking. John Harvey Kellogg invented cornflakes in the mindset it would stop masturbation. Maya Angelou worked as a sex worker, nightclub dancer and performer as a young adult. Some people tried to remove this from her history. Her response is the best. I wrote about my experiences because I thought too many people tell young folks I never did anything wrong. Who? Moi? Oh, so never I. I have no skeletons in my closet. In fact, I have no closet. The pyramids were constructed without hard hats or safety harnesses. They even delivered the stone used without properly aligning their circle of safety with cones. Lewis and Clark's fraternization with the locals on the well-known Expedition Essex. The Armenian Genocide. Systematic extermination of 1 5 million Armenians. Some countries still don't even recognize that it happened. Looking at you. Turkey. Peter the Great had a thing for midgets. He would keep them around for entertainment, and if the mood struck him he'd kill them in bizarre ways, such as putting a billow up their ass and pumping them full of air until they died. When he got married he forced 2 midgets to get married in a ceremony that mirrored his own. He brought in midgets from all across Russia to be the guests, and then he and his friends laughed and made fun of them the entire time. During reception they forced them to drink copious amounts of alcohol. Some of them even died from drinking. They made them do crazy stuff during the reception, and if my memory serves me correctly, the bride and groom had to consummate the marriage in front of Peter while he laughed and humiliated them. Did you know that General Custer, completely naked outside a pair of boots, a hat, and an ascot, dodged frantic arrow fire in the heat of battle just to outpay a Native American female tied up to a cactus? That George Washington had 30 dicks, was 12 stories tall, and powered by radiation. The amount of outpay in every single campaign from the earliest recorded camp games to the most recent ones. Egyptian pharaohs were notorious for incest. Actually, we did learn this in 7th grade. Dr. Seuss, the famous children's book writer, cheated on his wife who had cancer. When she found out, she killed herself. 1 knife. 2 knife. Dead wife. New life. Napoleon would forbid Josephine to bathe 4 weeks at a time because he liked her extra nasty down there. James Joyce was a dirty old man. Yeats had pig testicles sewn onto himself to be more virile. Irish poets were really weird. Edit. Hash. MN, specifically Mankato, is the site of the largest lynching in U.S. Life with the Puritans was so boring that whenever Puritan children were kidnapped by Native Americans, the children would beg the Native Americans not to sell them back to their parents. In 1973, a guinea pig named Randy broke out of its cage into a female enclosure and impregnated more than 100 of them. Gandhi was a dirty old man. Buzz Aldrin was the first person to pee on the moon. According to dog law, he now owns it. The existence and nature of spacesuits makes me disagree with your conclusion. I never knew how big a jackass Thomas Edison was back in school. All I was taught was how genius he was for inventing all these cool things we now used. I don't remember learning of Tesla at all. Edison pretty much stole patents from everybody working for him. Rape of Native American women was so common by cowboys during the expansion of the West that the native women often resorted to shoving sand into their vaginas when they saw cowboys approaching as a defensive measure. I'll paraphrase Dave Chappelle on this one. The 2 pages in history about JFK and Marilyn Monroe aren't taught in school because they are stuck together. That famous guy you heard of? Yeah, that one. He liked to FCK. 9/11 was an inside job. Jet fuel can't melt dank memes. Alexander Hamilton had a torrid affair. Canadian priests outpaid and molested children in Indian residential schools. Also made children outpay and molest younger children. All in the name of civilization. During the war in the Pacific, World War II, after the Japanese soldiers captured a town for their garrisons in the Philippines, they would cut the breasts of the women they outpaid as trophies using their bayonets. Helen Keller was kind of a bigot. She wouldn't speak or even look at black people. Jim Jones and his cult. That incident is one of the most disturbing crimes ever committed, and I was particularly upset that it was never mentioned in school, as I found out about on a top 10 list on YouTube 2 years after I graduated high school. There's so much to be learned from Jones Massacre. How did you get until after high school without hearing the phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid? I got this one. So, most people know that the Romans wiped their asses with sponges on a stick. Most don't know they soaked said sponges in vinegar. We are all told about how when Jesus was dying on the cross, Some Roman soldier gave Jesus sour wine on a sponge. Most people don't connect the two. Yes. Your history teacher will probably not mention that Ben Franklin had a thing for older women. Total cougar hunter. Your history teacher will also probably not mention that Ben Franklin was totally right. If you play Assassin's Creed 3 and have your character stand next to Ben Franklin, he will tell you all about the benefits of having an older woman as a mistress over a younger woman. Bill Clinton did have sex with that woman. MKUltra was a program run by the CIA to test the effects of drugs on unsuspecting people. A man named Sidney Gottlieb was the main proponent to that last part. Unsuspecting people. He and others at the CIA believed that drugs were the way to mind control. Specifically, they were fond of LSD. Many know of the awful LSD experiments, but Gottlieb took them a step further, drugging random people at the CIA. At random bars. Or anywhere else they could. The affected would be followed and monitored to determine their state of mind and potential vulnerability. It was largely a response to paranoia that the Soviets were doing the same. This line of thinking pushed the CIA well beyond the legal rights of a federal agency. Gottlieb was directly involved with one case where a man was dosed with a lot of LSD. In essence, lost his mind shortly after and committed suicide when CIA officers attempted to clean up the mess. The CIA never admitted to the family what happened to their husband. But after the church committee, they actually had to piece together that their husband and father was the victim of the CIA. Back in the 1700s, a well-known puppeteer who would travel Europe was found dead in his home. When his home was searched, there were dead kids found buried in his walls, floors and garden, all missing their skin. For a while no one knew what he did with their skins until someone decided to examine his puppets. They were all made from the skins of the dead children. After some investigating, it turns out that after every show a kid would end up missing and a new puppet would be included in the next show, and each puppet was one child. He had 76 puppets. Well, I guess that Pinocchio was a real boy at one point.